staff team from the International Monetary Fund, led by Mary Goodman, conducted a hybrid mission to Kenya from March 31st to April 22nd. Here's a quote from Mary Goodman on the outcome of the meeting. She says the IMF staff team and the Kenyan authorities reached a staff-level agreement on the third review of Kenya's economic program under the EFF and ECF arrangements. The agreement is subject to approval of IMF management and the executive board in the coming weeks. She continues, upon completion of the executive board review, Kenya would have access to special drawing rights of about 179 million, worth about $244 million, bringing the total financial support to about $8 billion. That's Mary Goodman, IMF chief to Kenya. Joining me now from Kenya to discuss further, Churchill Ogutu, who's an economist with IC Asset Managers. Churchill, good afternoon to you. Starting with the IMF, do these special drawing rights equate to actual dollars?
Thank you, Rotas. Yes, for the special drawing rights, that's the currency that is used by IMF, but obviously they'll have to be converted to dollars. Currently, we're looking at one special drawing right is equivalent to 1.35 dollars at the current exchange rate. So basically, they'll have to be converted to dollars for us now to utilize them.
Is the outcome of the meeting an endorsement of the management of the Kenyan economy so far?
Interesting. Allow me to use a phrase to paraphrase a phrase. Ideally, we are saying that the IMF doesn't control the weather, but he happens to be the umbrella salesman in town. And that happened what we saw in 2 years ago, whereby we had last year actually, where we got into a 38-month program with the IMF, and every 6 months, Kenya discusses with IMF just to preview some of the prearranged structural benchmarks. So that is what has happened. It may not likely be an endorsement of how Kenya is managing the economy, but ideally there are 4 conditions that were put forward at the beginning of this IMF program. Something to do with fiscal consolidation, basically looking at raising revenue in the country, monetary policy, conditionalities, and fiscal reforms within the state-owned enterprises. So ideally, each and every 6 months is just looking at how the progress has been done. So it may not necessarily be an endorsement by the IMF on Kenya's management of its economy, but ideally we are just trying to toe the lines that IMF put in place when we embarked into the program with them.
I'm glad you mentioned the fiscal side. Considering Kenya's fiscal challenges, will more money be asked for going forward?
I don't think that we'll get higher financing by IMF at this point in time. The 38-month program is totaling around $2.34 billion that will be getting each and every 6 months some portion of that amount. So, and looking at the current financing needs in the current budget and getting into the next financial year, which is starting in 2 months' time, we don't have any financing gap. In the event that there's a financing gap, basically if our financing resources are fall lower than the expenditure in the budget, current budget and the next budget, that is where probably we could see the government now raising from domestic sources. I don't think now they'll be able to knock on the doors of IMF seeking some additional financing, but probably they'll now seek in the event that there's a financing gap that arises in the current financial year and the next one, they'll now be able to meet that deficit from domestic sources.
All right, excellent. All right, so speaking of domestic sources, or rather domestic matters and fiscal issues, Kenya is spending a lot on subsidies. Let's start with cooking gas subsidies. What do you make of the outlay, 471 million, which is an increase for LPG?
It's quite interesting. This is something that has played out in the last fiscal years. For the next financial year, they're expecting 471 million allocated at least towards LPG gases, liquid petroleum gases. And this is basically to 100,000 low-income households in the country, purchasing of 6 kilogram LPG gas cylinder and also the gas cooker. But now the point is, yes, these initial outlays to the low-income households, but now there's that additional expenses that will come each and every time that LPG gas runs out, that portion of injecting monies to the low-income houses, that is not coming in. So it's just a way of improving access to at least efficient energy sources away from the charcoal and firewood and getting into more efficient sources. But that said, it will also imply some cost to some of the low-income houses as they replenish the 6 kg cylinders as they come as they come short. So that's one thing that the government hasn't really fully thought about it. It's one thing now to give cylinders and gas cookers to low-income houses. It's another thing to ensure that there's continuous usage of that specific energy source that they envisage within the energy policy.
So, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that. How much longer can these go on if LPG prices continue to rise? Because I think it's double-digit increase in prices year on year in Kenya, around the world. How much longer can these subsidies go on for?
To be honest, it's not sustainable. We are looking at the current financial year, 417 million allocated towards the LPG subsidy. The next financial year, we are looking at another something in the order of 900 million shillings for the LPG subsidy. And yet we are seeing that LPG prices, as you correctly mentioned, has gone up. One thing that was put in place in the current financial year was now the taxation of LPG gases. That thing wasn't there before, up until July last year, whereby there was that VAT that was imposed on LPG gases. And we've seen that the prices of LPG in Kenya have started to skyrocket. And in addition to what you've seen, the supply chains disruption from external sources. So that has led to uptick in LPG prices. So I don't think that ultimately subsidy is the right route to go. So in my view is that I don't think it's quite sustainable going forward.
Yeah, trust me, we're having the same conversations here with fuel subsidies. From LPG to electricity, Churchill, why the delay in the promise to cut power tariffs by 15% from the Kenyan government?
Yes, I think this is an execution risk at play. We had a task force by the president that published its recommendation on what's the way forward, at least to ensure that electricity prices in Kenya are lowered. And a number of issues that came is that a number of the independent power producers, their cost of producing electricity was way higher than what Kenyan is a national energy producer in Kenya was. So the cost that was being done that came from the independent power producers was way higher than the cost that was being done by Kenyan, the monopoly. So what happened is a number of draft measures were put in place to ensure that the independent power producers in Kenya, that they could be able to lower their cost to the Kenya Power, and ultimately consumers will be able to benefit from that. But ever since that report was published and publicized, it was expected that the independent power producers on one hand will be able to negotiate with the Ministry of Energy on the other hand to ensure that that is unlocked, but that hasn't played out. So it's just issues around execution risk at play with this delayed in talks between the independent power producers and also the Kenya Power on the other side.
And I mean, okay, so we've added this now to LPG. There's also fuel subsidies. You got this electricity talk. Is all this being done to, it might be a cynical question, but as far as winning over the electorate ahead of we know there are elections this year. Is that why all this is taking place, or is this just economic support for the average Kenyan?
Yeah, it's just the economic support that has been in place over the last fiscal years. It's just that now they are more or less hit up ahead of the elections, and probably we could see some heightened focus towards the current subsidies, at least to be able to get some votes as we approach the elections in 4 months' time. So I think that this is something that it's not directly related to the upcoming elections per se, but something that has been played out over the course of a number of years. Is only that because of the current supply disruptions, a number of issues that have come into play, that's when they have been more or less magnified. But nonetheless, it's been something in play.
It's going to be very interesting to see how things play out. I wanted to get your thoughts on the increase in diaspora remittances that came in this quarter. It looks like it was a healthy increase for year on year. I guess, is that a good sign?
Yes, it's quite something that is supportive to Kenyan inflows. The current account is usually in deficit, but the bright spots in that is usually the diaspora remittance, which has been quite healthy. Even when the onset of COVID came in, we thought that the diaspora remittance might plunge, but we started to seeing a healthy rebound coming in from our expatriates abroad, or the diaspora community now remitting monies home. So that's quite strong, and we're seeing that it's been supported by the remittances channels, which was not there before a couple of years back, but we started to see that there's been some proactiveness from the government perspective, from the central bank perspective, at least to harness these remittances coming home. So I think that we'll still continue to see that picking up even as we get into the electioneering period, as more and more people, the diasporan communities start remitting monies to people back home. So the onus is on the government to ensure that this is unlocked, to ensure that it's getting into the right places, at least to boost the investment environment in Kenya.
Fantastic. And what's your, I guess that's healthy. What's your outlook for the Kenyan economy, I guess, looking at the rest of this fiscal year?
To be honest, it's quite frail. We are still muddling through the successes we've been getting, be it from the growth numbers, obviously being boosted because of the lifting of the COVID restrictions. But I think there are some challenges that are still on the horizon. From one side, we're still seeing fiscal concerns, be it from the debt metrics. The sustainability of that is quite a concern, and it's weighing on the fiscal. And that by itself is even impacting on the delivery of the budget for the current financial year and the next one. And that will have a negative impact even in the growth going forward. So to summarize it, I'm still seeing some negative, I have some concerns in regards to the growth outlook for the better 3 quarters of this current year.
All very interesting. Subsidies, remittances, elections, just everything's going on in Kenya. And we're glad to have you to talk us through it all. Churchill Ogutu, economist with IC Asset Managers. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Live from Nairobi.